While we eagerly await the result, recording just begun. I'll start again. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Roger Tornaden, Director of Business Management and Legal Programs for UCLA Extension. While we eagerly await the resumption of our popular UCLA Extension Annual Restaurant Executive Conference, we offer highly relevant executive level webinars like this one, sharing new ideas, data, and practices to help our companies return to solid growth and profitability. We plan a Q&A session after Jerry shares the Anderson forecast findings that relate to our restaurant industry. Please send in your questions during Jerry's presentation and I'll pose them to him during the Q&A session. Today's webinar is recorded, as you know, and we'll send a copy of the recording to all who registered. If you'd like to know more about the extensive work and the forecast's quarterly meetings, please know that we'll send you a link to the Anderson Forecast homepage when we send you the recording. Additionally, we'll send you a link to the most recent Anderson Forecast quarterly event, which took place a few weeks ago. It's my privilege now to introduce Dr. Jerry Nickelsburg, head of UCLA's Anderson Forecast. Jerry joined the UCLA Anderson School of Management and the UCLA Forecast approximately 15 years ago. And since 2017, he served as faculty director of the Forecast. Jerry brings significant business experience to the table in addition to his academic respect. Jerry had executive positions with McDonnell Douglas, Flight Safety International, and Flight Safety Boeing during a 15-year span in the aviation business. He additionally has developed forecasting tools for the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and has advised banks, investors, and financial institutions. He's often cited in the national media, but let's move ahead so we spend as much time as we can with Jerry. On behalf of our Restaurant Executive Advisory Board, I really appreciate today's collaboration among UCLA's Anderson Forecast, our restaurant and hospitality industry executives, and UCLA Extension. This is our first formal webinar collaboration and is in the UCLA spirit of making all of us at UCLA more relevant and supportive of our community. Jerry, take it away.
Thank you, Roger. Can you all hear me okay? So it's a pleasure to be here with you this morning and to be with Roger and Joshua and the entire UCLA Extension team. As Roger said, I am on the faculty at UCLA Anderson and faculty director of the UCLA Anderson Forecast. We do a number of programs, so would be happy for you to reach out and connect with us in the future. But let's go to our topic for today. So I'm going to share my slides and this should be it. And it would just take a minute. You would think I'd be faster with this since we've been teaching on Zoom for 1.5 years, although we're now back in the classroom, which is really, really nice, but it's still limited. So what I want to talk about today are COVID-related issues for the restaurant and hospitality industries. And you all know what's happening with your business. So at a micro level, what I'd like to do is talk about the macro level. What are the trends? What are the implications of those trends? And how do we think about those in terms of where the restaurant industry is going to go, where the economy is going to go? And so we have a roadmap here of what we're going to do in the next 35 to 45 minutes, and then we'll get to your questions. And the first is just look at the US outlook. What is happening in the US and how did the Delta variant change that? And that has fundamental implications for leisure and hospitality and other sectors in the economy, where in order to deliver the services to customers, there needs to be a high degree of human contact. And from that, we'll touch on an issue that keeps coming up, and that is inflation worries. What's happening with inflation? How do we think about that? And is that important as we go out, certainly past the next 12 months? From that, I want to look at California employment and kind of what is the shape, what's the nature of this recession, and return to the office and other drivers of the California economy. And of course, return to the office is important for many in the restaurant industry because those who are in the office go out to lunch or happy hour or dinner afterwards in the employment center, typically city cores. And if they're not in the office, those restaurants don't have the demand for their business. So let's jump right in. And this is our June 2nd forecast, which is pre-Delta. And so let me just take you through this slide for a moment. The blue represents what were actuals at the time. That light red are forecasts for 2021, and the dark red, the longer term forecast. And what we were looking at in June, which was an abatement of the pandemic, was that by the end of the second quarter of 2021, we would be back to the previous 2019 peak. And just drawing a straight line through that 2.4% growth in GDP, which is represented by those blue blocks, 2018 and 2019, we are, as we get into the first quarter of next year, above trend. So that was our forecast, but then Delta happened. And I like this quote from Albert Camus' The Plague, published in English in 48, I guess in French 1 year earlier. But it says, the reserves of emotion pent up during those many months when for everybody, the flame of life burned low, were being recklessly squandered to celebrate their survival. That was all of us going out to restaurants and bars, particularly when they were, here in California, outside venues to celebrate our survival. But then that euphoria ended with Delta. And that was kind of unexpected because we had a high degree of vaccination. And even though Delta tore through the unvaccinated community, there were breakthroughs. And, in thinking about that, well, what's going to happen with the economy going forward? One thing that we observed is those folks who were vaccinated, they don't want new closures. They say, I'm protected enough and I don't want to spend another year like last year. And of course, those who were not vaccinated are, and this is a real gross generalization, but they never really wanted closures. So the question is, what do these closures do? And how do we understand them? Because we're entering now a period of time when the Swedish model will be a model for that we'll be following going forward through the end of the Delta wave and maybe beyond that. And that Swedish model is one of no closures. So let's go back, look at the closures, try and understand them, and see what the implication of not having closures might be. And if you recall, back in the early part of 2020, there's a lot of discussion about the trade-off between closures and the economy. That if you kept things open, you would have a better economy, more employment, more income, but the health outcomes might be a little bit worse. It varied between states. California took the position that the health outcomes were more important. So did the state of Washington, Virginia, Maryland, a number of states. And some states, you can think of Florida and Texas as examples, but many others took the position the economy was more important and there should be much less restrictive interventions for public health purposes. So let's dive in. Here's what happened in 2020. We have data on 2020, so we can actually go back and look. This is Scandinavia. On the horizontal axis is infection rate, and that's per capita infection rate. And on the vertical axis is the change in real GDP for the year 2020. Now I'm using infection rates rather than mortality rates because mortality was very much, and has to this point been very much skewed towards older adults, many of whom were not in the labor force. Infection rates matter because people who are sick don't go to work, and therefore they don't produce. And sometimes it leads to very bad outcomes, but infection rate seems to be the better metric here. So here's what we have for Scandinavia for 2020. And so let's look at the top 4 dots. Sweden is right there with Finland and Denmark, about the same reduction in GDP, right around 3%. So Sweden didn't do any better than Finland and Denmark in terms of economic outcomes. It did worse than Norway, which is up at the top. But across the horizontal axis, we see Sweden did much worse in health outcomes. So worse health outcomes, certainly no better economic outcomes. Now I put Iceland here, and is it Scandinavian or not? Hard to say. Certainly in the language group it is. But what Iceland, why I put Iceland on this graph is that Iceland is heavily dependent on international tourism, and that shut down. So Iceland did much worse. They had better health outcomes, but they did much worse because of tourism. And that's going to give us a hint as to what we can expect when we look at the data for the US, that many other factors besides just the interventions are important. So a similar graph for the US for 2020. And in this graph, these are all states, about half the states, that have greater than 5 million population. And I've separated them out. I'm only showing you this one. I could show you less than 5 million population. It would look the same. But you don't really want to mix the two together because you have states such as Alaska and Wyoming and North Dakota that are heavily dependent on extractive industries. So what happens with oil prices, for example, very much affects their economic performance. So these are the large states, the ones that produce virtually all of US GDP. And again, across the horizontal axis is the infection rate, and the vertical axis is the percentage change in GDP. And you notice that the red dots are to the right and down, and the green dots are to the left and up with 2 exceptions. The green dots are the states that had greater than average interventions, and those interventions will be closures, business closures, capacity limitations, and other restrictions on activity. And the red dots are those who had less than average. And you notice that California is there above Florida and above Texas. And many other states are kind of doing better. This looks a lot like that Scandinavian graph that I showed you earlier. There are 2 outliers. And if you took the 2 outliers out, this would be, of course, more dramatic. The 2 outliers are New York. And New York is kind of a special case because many people who work in New York live in New Jersey or live in Connecticut or have a home in what's sometimes called the 6th borough of New York, which is South Florida. And when they were working from home, their economic activity was attributed to other states. Michigan is there, and Michigan has to do with supply chain disruptions in the auto industry. And that has nothing to do with interventions. Michigan also has to do with international tourism. So as you know, Michigan is right up against Ontario, Canada, and the 3rd largest sector in the state of Michigan is leisure and hospitality, serving Canadians as well as Michiganders and others who come across the border to vacation in Michigan, and they were prohibited from doing so. So those 2 sectors made Michigan another outlier. So we get really the same kind of result. And the question is why? This seems so counterintuitive. And it has to do with signaling. So in states such as the state of Washington, the governor and legislature said, We're taking this very seriously, and we are intervening for public health. And if there's an establishment that we view is risky, too risky, we're going to order it closed. And at any establishment that you, the potential customer, sees that is open, you know that we deemed it as moderate to low risk, and there are protocols in place. And so consumers took that signal, that information, and used it. For the states that said, it's important for you, the consumer, to make your own choices, choose them wisely, but we're not going to intervene. Now you have households who are saying, well, is that a safe establishment to go to? Do they have protocols? That's information that has to be gathered over a whole set of establishments that we visit in the course of a week or a month. And that's much harder to ascertain. So on the one hand, the state is giving information and households are responding appropriately. In the other, the state's not giving information. And so now it's costly for households to ascertain, and they're withholding demand. And you can see this in these charts. So this is the upper left-hand chart, percentage change in retail sales versus NPIs, that's non-pharmaceutical interventions. And it is a comparison of July 2019 pre-pandemic to July 2020. And what you see is these are in-store sales, year-over-year percentage change on the vertical axis. And the more stringent, there's a small positive correlation with the stringency. People were withholding demand in states like Florida and Texas because an alternative to gathering information about your retail establishment was to go on Amazon, and that was pretty easy. And that was just 2 months. So looking at December 2019 to December 2020 on the right-hand side, and you see no correlation. That in fact, households respond to the environment that they're in, and we just didn't see this in retail sales. And you may say, well, but yeah, Texas had higher retail employment and higher other leisure and hospitality employment than California. But employment just means having a job. The question is, how many hours did you work? So just as an example, but it runs kind of all through this, California lost 4.6% of all retail payroll positions. Texas lost about 1.5%. So a big difference. And look at these graphs here and you say, well, that doesn't really correspond. For those who were working, that other 95.4% in California, their hours were cut by 1.5%. And in Texas, they were cut by 4.5%. So more people were working in Texas, but they were working fewer hours. So that's how that kind of equation balances. So how do we think about what's going to happen going forward? And so this is particularly relevant for the restaurant industry. We need to look back to times when people were making their decisions based on their willingness to accept risk and go to a restaurant, for example. And one of the more recent ones that we can look back to is what happened after the horrific attacks of 9/11. So you see US airline revenue passenger miles here. That's one person on a domestic flight who is in a seat that they paid for flying 1 mile. And this is January 2000 to September 2004. And you see it just goes on about 60 billion until you get to 9/11, it falls off a cliff. We get reinforced cockpit doors, TSA, air marshals, comes back quite a bit, but not all the way. And then it's a gradual coming back as people gather more information just by observing others and observing what has and has not happened. And it takes actually a long time, about 30 months to come back. And that is kind of a model for the restaurant industry. Coming back, but coming back slowly over time. Right now, because of Delta, people are saying, well, I don't know if there's going to be a kappa, lambda, mu, or some other Greek letter wave. So I want to be cautious. Not everyone, but there is a great deal of caution in the wind. So when we look at service recovery and goods recovery here, of course, we bought more goods because we weren't going out to restaurants and bars and events. And here's our forecast that it drops, services drop way below trend. The services are in red there. They drop way below trend, and then they kind of come back up, and we don't have them getting back to trend through our forecast horizon of 2023 Q4. And goods purchases go above trend and then kind of move back into trend. And so that gives us our new GDP forecast. And what we've done is shaded that one that I showed you a bit. That's the delta adjustment. But our original forecast that we would be at previous peak by the Q2 of 2021, that proved to be correct. And here, this gold area, that's the delta loss. And now when we do the 2.4% trend line, we find that we are maybe just about back to trend when we get to the end of 2023. So much slower adjustment as the pandemic wears on. Now let's turn to what's happening with labor shortages. And I actually don't like calling it labor shortages per se. It's more a change in the character of the labor market. But look at this labor force participation rate. And so what you see on the left-hand side is the national participation rate, and the shaded areas are recessions. And labor force participation rate grew dramatically all the way up to the end of the 1990s, in particular with women entering the labor force, and then has been declining since then. We get the big drop with the onset of the pandemic. It comes back some, but it doesn't really move very far. And we are looking at labor force participation today at 1977 levels. And one of the reasons is, it was commented on prior to the latest recession that boomers weren't retiring, they're keeping their jobs, and boomers were aging, of course, every year. It's something that happens to all of us, I guess. And now we get the pandemic and those retirements that didn't happen have happened. Boomers are a huge cohort of the population. And so that's a permanent downward shift in the labor force, one that every sector is going to have to adjust to. And it's also service workers making lifestyle choices. So you go through a year and a half of surviving on one income for a 2-income family, might decide that that's really a better option. Or, the lockdown times were times of introspection for us. And so we were thinking about that and thinking about, are we doing what we would like to be doing? And if not, what do we want to do? So there's a lot of churn in the labor market, and that's going to go on for some time. But one thing that is abundantly clear in the data is that the thought that labor force participation rate was really low and people weren't looking for jobs was because of the generous transfer payments. That has proved to be simply not correct. We don't see and didn't see any difference in job applications where people entering the labor force, when the states that ended early did so. We don't see any real change now. Okay, now going through the rest of the US forecast, we expect interest rates to remain low through 2023. The Fed's going to begin to taper their purchases, which means that green line, that's the 10-year Treasury notes, going to inch up, but only really inch up. And the Fed funds rate we're expecting to change at the end of next year. But these are still going to be exceedingly low interest rates, which is a boon to capital investment and certainly to automation in the restaurant industry. And so that feeds into our forecast for non-residential real fixed investment. running at about 5% higher than normal. The pandemic has induced lots of technological change, particularly in your industry. And now just briefly on inflation. So we have here on the left-hand side, consumer prices, on the right-hand side, producer prices. This is only 2004 to 2021. We could extend it back. But if you look, kind of sweep your eyes from left to right on the first graph and from left to right on the second, there are some peaks, but we've seen those peaks before. There's nothing here that's really unusual. What is unusual are supply chain interruptions. And, I went out to Catalina this last weekend. And as you go out on the ferry through Queens Gate, through the Port of Los Angeles, I mean, you could walk jumping from ship to ship halfway to Catalina for all the ships that are tied up trying to get into the ports. We have supply chain interruptions. That means fewer goods. That pushes up prices. There's nothing to indicate that inflation's become unhinged here. And a couple arrows there. And this is the financial market view looking ahead for inflation over the next 10 years. And they have it as actually fairly low in the 2.5% range. So we don't see any indication that there's going to be long run inflation, but do expect this year and perhaps into next year, as these supply chains sort themselves out, that we'll see a greater than 2.5% increase in overall prices. So now turning to California, and let's go by sector. And I think this is really telling. This is the change in non-farm payroll jobs from February 2020 to August 2021, our latest data. And if you look on the right-hand side where I've drawn this circle, what you see is 2/3 of all jobs lost in the state of California, these are non-farm payroll jobs, are right there in that circle. And they are leisure and hospitality, which is where your industry lives, education, and education is, the schools were closed, other services, which is personal care services, and retail trade. High degree of human contact. But what's been happening in the last couple of months, leisure and hospitality is coming back. So that's the first one on the left-hand side in the light blue, I guess. Education as schools are opening up, and other services. So there's a move back, and this, remember the fear of flying slide. You move back, but it comes back slowly. There's still a lot of job loss in those three sectors. The next three are professional, scientific, and technical services, administrative services, and information. Administrative services are temps, but they're also consultants. And this is where tech lies. Tech drove the California economy to be the second fastest growing state in the US after Washington, which was also driven by tech in the last expansion. We expect the same this time. But tourism is going to depend on domestic travel. The left-hand graph is international passenger arrivals relative to December of 2019. With the red there is SFO and the black is LAX. And they're still down 75 to 80%. Remember the story about information and choosing wisely. Well, abroad, all people know is that the US has really been suffering with the Delta surge. And indeed, Europe put the US back on the risky list. So international tourists are not coming. And that means that restaurants and other establishments that primarily serve or that have a large percentage of their demand coming from international tourists, they're not going to be getting that, certainly not for the next 12 months. But on the right-hand side is something I picked up from the North Bay Business Journal, and that's hotel occupancy. And you can see it's got a lot of seasonal fluctuation, as you would expect. But it really is kind of back to approximately where it was pre-pandemic. So we're traveling domestically, shorter distances, maybe staying shorter times, but domestic tourism is really what needs to make up for the international tourism. And our view is it's not going to entirely make up for it because they tend to be clustered in different places. For example, Chinese tourists, of which we had 1.8 million in California in 2018, they typically don't go to Napa Valley, but they do go to San Francisco. And in San Francisco, you have low occupancy rates of hotels. Napa Valley, pretty good occupancy rates of hotels. Moving on, home sales have slowed, but so that's what we read in the paper. But if we look at it historically, they're above the average of the last expansion, with the exception of when we just came right out of all of those foreclosures, and those were being blown out. So home sales are still fairly robust. Home prices remain high. You have two graphs here. The S&P Case-Shiller, which is one measure of home prices, and it's only for 3 cities in California. But you can see over on the right, home prices higher than they've been historically. And the right, it comes from California Association of Realtors. It's the median home price for the state, also still high. So we have high home prices and home sales that are above average. That means that developers can make business plans that hunt. And when they develop new properties, you need services for those properties. So there are opportunities in the restaurant industry as well as in retail following the new developments of new housing developments. So let's turn to I think this may be the final topic here for the day before we get to your questions. And that is, are people leaving California for remote work? Certainly relevant for the part of your industry that serves those who were in the office. And I took this from the San Francisco Chronicle. It's an analysis of the change of addresses that were filed with the US Post Office. And it's for the Bay Area. And there were about 104,000 that moved. Of that 104,000, 84,000 stayed in the Bay Area. They just moved a little further out. And that makes sense. If you're told by Google or Facebook that you're going to be working from home for a year, you don't need to be renting an apartment in Cupertino. You can rent one a little bit further out. And the consequences of that is you get to save the difference in the rent. The next was 24,000 that moved to Southern California. And then out of state, 1,200 to the state of Washington. That's a very normal amount of movement. And we hear a lot, because it makes good press, that everyone's leaving for Texas. Of that 104,000, there were 750 that went to Texas. So people aren't leaving California. And if they're not leaving and they're not going far, the question is, will they return to the office? Our view is yes, definitely. And we're seeing this already, that there's a fairly strong movement back to the office. And the reasons are, it's hard to network from your home office, or if you're in your apartment sitting on your bed. Networking is hard, and particularly for younger employees, and particularly for those whose job it is to bring in new business, that's hard to do from home. There's a social aspect, which we've discovered that we really miss. There's a certain social aspect to our work lives and our work communities. Initially, when we started working from home, our productivity levels were still high, maybe even higher. We worked a few longer hours. That has abated over time. So productivity is higher in the office, particularly when you need ideas, when you need creativity. Pretty hard to convince the boss that you should be promoted or get a pay raise if the boss only sees you in a Zoom Hollywood Squares like we have today. But if you're in front of the boss and the boss is seeing kind of all of the aspects of what you're doing, that makes it easier to get promotions and pay. And when people realize that, even though they might otherwise want to stay at home, they're coming in. Onboarding of new employees, hard to get the culture of the organization unless you get all those nonverbal signals, and hard to supervise employees. And, there's a real sense of separation of work and non-work life that is important. We hear these stories, and they're total anecdotal stories because they're cute, of people who will finish work at home, go get in their car, drive around the block in a faux commute, just to signal that their work is over with and now it's time for home life. And not everyone can afford a home office. I think a lot of those who thought we're going to be working from home were not renting in San Francisco a one-bedroom apartment and sitting at their kitchen table or sitting on their bed working. That's a much tougher sale than if you have a separate office at home. So all of these say, we're going back to the office, take a little while, but the city cores are going to be vibrant once again, and the demand for restaurant services are certainly going to be there once again. So the last thing, I said that was last. The last thing I want to bring up is a study that we did of restaurants in Los Angeles during the time, as a 4-year study, during the time when parts of the county of Los Angeles were on a different minimum wage than the city of Los Angeles, Santa Monica, and Beverly Hills. So this is a new piece of research that we've done. It actually follows on some of the work that Dave Card at Berkeley, who just won the Nobel Prize for his work, did. And that was pioneering work and has certainly informed us. But the economics literature is mixed on the impact of the minimum wage increases. And the answer that we found was that it really depends on the competitive environment of the restaurant. So for example, restaurants in affluent neighborhoods were able to pass on increases in prices to their customers. Restaurants in non-affluent neighborhoods, so the customers bore the cost. Restaurants in non-affluent neighborhoods, or who were competing with restaurants across the minimum wage border, were not, but they changed their menus more often. So they were, in effect, changing their price. But near the minimum wage border, we had higher incidence of restaurant closures. And that meant that the incidence was going to fall on landlords through having to offer lower rents to get someone else into that restaurant space. And it fell on owners through lower returns, and on workers through needing to have higher work effort in the new environment. So the answer about minimum wage is very contextual, and we can't make any generalizations about it. We have to kind of look at our own competitive environment in order to understand that. And so to finish up, international tourism is going to recover last. Leisure and hospitality for office workers will see a gradual recovery into 2023, but a real recovery. The housing boom is going to create new opportunities. Domestic tourism will be a buffer, but not a complete one. And labor shortages are going to imply higher wages and more capital investment. And with regard to that capital, and consumer demand has changed in fundamental ways. It provides opportunities, but it also provides risks. And here's some of that capital investment, a picture of robotic servers. And with that, let me end and see if I've answered all your questions with this.
Thank you, Jerry. I do have a few questions, and please, for all of our attendees, if you have questions for Jerry, please just note them in the Q&A box, and I'll bring them up. But the first question has to do with the slowness in which workers seem to be coming back into leisure and hospitality. Does that have implications for additional significant compensation increases for the industry?
So the short answer is yes, and it's not just it's also not just a short-term phenomenon. And the way to think about this is that pre-COVID, restaurant workers, were hired at a wage. It was kind of an equilibrium wage. The restaurants were able to get the staffing that they needed at the prevailing wage. What has changed is the job. And one part of the job, for example, a server is doing the same thing. They're going, taking orders, going to the kitchen, bringing back the food, checking on the customer, all of that's the same. But what has changed about that job is it's now riskier. That there are health risks that are there in that job. And even when COVID is this bad nightmare in the rearview mirror, we have a memory of that, and that there could be another pandemic that or pathogen that comes our way. And as is typical in any employment situation, compensation has to compensate for both the specific task and the risk associated with that task. And that risk is now there, and that risk requires higher compensation. So it's, it's not just that workers aren't coming back, it's also that in the restaurant industry, restaurants are trying to figure out, what do we need to pay in order to get the staffing that we want? And that's kind of a process of discovery, right? So just to take an extreme example, a restaurant that offered $30 an hour for all of its employees probably wouldn't have a shortage of labor, but they probably also wouldn't want to offer $30. So where is it? Is it $15.50? Is it $17.50? Where is that? And right now we're going through a process of trying to discover that. But as I say, post-pandemic, that's still going to be there on the mind of everyone who wants to work in leisure and hospitality, in retail, in personal care services. They're going to be cognizant that there's an additional risk associated with performing those services, and that's going to require higher compensation.
Thank you, Jerry. I have a second question on sort of a different aspect, and that is transportation costs, not necessarily the port from China to the United States, but the cost of drivers and transportation inside the United States. Apparently there has been news about truck drivers receiving extremely high compensation. And do you have any thoughts on the transportation inside the United States? Or are we looking at higher costs as a result of the environment that we've been through?
I mean, we are certainly for the near term. So unlike restaurant staff, transportation workers, the increased cost is going to be temporary. So what has happened here? There was already something of a shortage of truck drivers pre-pandemic. And that was kind of being worked through, but slowly. Now we are sitting at home, and we can't go out and have a nice social meal at a restaurant. So what do? We play on the internet and we buy goods. And the demand for goods really spikes. And that means things produced in Asia, in China, but also elsewhere in Asia. Except that the pandemic's not just in the US. So we have all these supply chain interruptions. In China, that mostly got worked through, and the goods start getting loaded on ships. And now the issue is they're sitting on the ships. They can't be unloaded because the docks are full of containers, and there are not enough trucks to take the containers away. So this is a temporary shortage, but definitely one. And so to get more truck drivers, trucking companies are offering incentives, and it's higher costs. So we're seeing that on transocean shipping, and some of the big retailers in the US, if you think of Walmart and Target and the like, are actually going out and chartering freighters to bring goods to other less congested ports on kind of longer journeys. This is all sort of temporary. In normal times, if you didn't have your goods on a ship by now, you're going to miss the holiday season. So there's a real rush to try and rebuild inventories for the holiday season. That's going to impact domestic freight charges.
Thank you, Troy. One question related to the low interest rates environment and related also to a number of restaurant closures during the past year and a half. Do you see longer term opportunities on the positive side for restaurant operators to acquire, to find better deals in terms of restaurant expansion based upon where we've been and the condition of the commercial real estate market?
I think there are, and there are many aspects to this, right? So we have an abnormally high closure rate of restaurants due to the withdrawal of demand, either mandated by NPIs in some states or simply people not going out in other states because of the risk. And that means that in the commercial real estate sphere, the owners of those spaces, they can repurpose those spaces, but they already have a lot of the fit out for another restaurant. However, they're going to have to lower the rent because there is an abnormally high amount of supply. And as we move forward and as we sort of normalize the demand for the restaurant experience, what you can expect to happen is new restaurants to open up, and those new restaurants are able to get lower lease rates, but also the low interest rates, which the person who asked the question correctly pointed out, means that the landlord can invest in more customized fit out and still make their rate of return. So that definitely creates opportunities. For brand new restaurant establishments, such as in these housing developments that I talked about, low interest rates means a lower cost of capital to build and fit out a new restaurant. So these do definitely provide opportunities. And I think where we are now is wait and see, because it all depends on the pandemic and none of us know how that's going to play out. But remember that fear of flying graph, and it kind of comes back slowly. If we continue to follow that, then sort of every month what we get is more opportunities for new businesses to open up and really take advantage of the increasing demand.
I have two more questions in front of me. And again, if our participants would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function. The first question of the last two, it sounds as though the forecast doesn't expect there to be any significant inflation. Is that correct?
So I'm going to give a yes and no answer, and as an economist, I can do that. In the longer run, we do not expect significant inflation. It's not going to be the 1970s all over again. At least that's what all of the data is telling us. In the near term, because of these supply shortages and because the economy is adjusting to a new world, a more automated world, a different world, we are going to see significant inflation. And something in the 3 to 4% range this year and into the early part of next year is not going to be a surprise. But as we move out further, supply chains resolve themselves, labor and capital shift around, reflecting the new demands in the post-pandemic economy, there simply isn't any evidence that we're going to get higher inflation. And I'll make one more comment on that. It used to be and when I was in graduate school and all of my contemporaries were, that we would look at expansions in the money supply and deficit spending as one way to expand the money supply. And there was a very high correlation between that and inflation. The thing is that we don't use dollar bills anymore. We use Visa and MasterCard and Discover, and so sorry for those that I didn't mention. And our use of money as a means of transactions has changed fundamentally. And cash is a store of value for us, not a means of transactions, a store of value in accounting. So all of the economic theory that was applicable in the 70s with respect to inflation does not seem to be applicable today.
Thanks, Jerry. And the final question I have, the big takeaway for me today was that you were expecting risks associated with the pandemic to be one of the key drivers in raising restaurant wages. Once the risk has abated, do you see a return to lower wages, or will the increases be permanent?
I expect them to be permanent because there's a difference between actual risks. So that would be, the epidemiologist creates some analysis and gives what percentage probability that you would become ill working as wait staff in a restaurant, for example. And there's the perceived risk, which is how do the people who might take those positions feel the risk, feel about the risk. I don't expect them to say, oh, the risk is abated, so I don't really need that compensation. I think this is, this started February, March 2020. Here we are, October 2021. We're still far from out of it. That is enough to embed in the mind of potential restaurant staff that this is fundamentally a riskier job. And so in that sense, I don't expect it to abate. Now, of course, as you go forward, as you go forward in time, the further we get away from this pandemic and the absence of new risks, that will cause, that will cause in the minds of the potential staff that this is not as risky as maybe they previously thought. If we are lucky and it's another 100 years before we have another pandemic, then sure, that's going to happen, but it'll take, that would take some time, and don't expect to see it anytime soon.
Well, at this point, Jerry, I'd like to really thank you again on behalf of all of us in the real estate, in the UCLA Extension group and the Restaurant Executive Board for your ideas and your thoughts. It's very much appreciated. And we will be working toward reestablishing our annual conference next spring. And our expectation is, I think in line with yours, that the risks won't be increasing, that they'll be, if anything, decreasing, and we can have our face-to-face conference again. But we're going to begin planning for that. But thank you again, Jerry. And if there's anything that you would like to leave us with, please do.
I just want to say thank you, Roger, for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here with you and UCLA Extension, and I hope there was some valuable information today. So wishing everyone well for the rest of the day and the rest of the year.
Thank you, Jerry. We look forward to seeing you at our conference next year. Take care.
That would be nice, yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.